The notification sound on my phone cut through the morning silence like a knife. 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was still in my pajamas, coffee mug halfway to my lips, when I saw the subject line that would change everything. Employment termination, effective immediately. 20 years of dedication, of building systems from scratch, of turning a failing company into an industry leader, reduced to a cold, impersonal email that probably took Marcus Whitfield 30 seconds to compose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing about knowing your worth in a company you've practically built with your own hands. You don't just sit around waiting for the axe to fall. You prepare. And boy, had I prepared. My name is Chloe Reynolds, and I'm 45 years old. For the past 2 decades, I've been the backbone of Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions here in Denver, Colorado. This is the story of how one email became the biggest mistake my boss ever made, and how 20 years of loyalty turned into the most satisfying professional victory of my life. When I first walked through the doors of Pinnacle Manufacturing in 2005, the company was hemorrhaging money faster than water through a broken dam. The original owner, Robert Pinnacle, had inherited the business from his father but lacked the operational expertise to keep it afloat in an increasingly competitive market. The office smelled like desperation and stale coffee, with outdated equipment scattered across a warehouse that looked more like a graveyard for industrial dreams than a thriving business. I was 25 then, fresh out of college with a degree in operations management and enough student loans to motivate me through any challenge. Robert hired me as a coordinator, basically a glorified administrative assistant, but he saw something in me that I hadn't even recognized in myself yet. Within my first week, I'd identified 17 critical inefficiencies in their supply chain alone. Their vendor relationships were a mess, their inventory system was tracked on actual paper clipboards, and their client communication consisted of scattered phone calls and handwritten notes that frequently got lost. Robert gave me carte blanche to fix whatever I could find. It wasn't just a job for me, it became a mission. I spent my first year completely overhauling their operational infrastructure. I digitized their entire inventory management system, negotiated better contracts with suppliers, and established standardized communication protocols with clients. More importantly, I built relationships. Real, lasting partnerships with vendors who trusted my word, and clients who knew they could count on Pinnacle to deliver exactly what they needed, when they needed it. By my 3rd year, I'd been promoted to operations manager. By my 7th year, I was senior operations manager with a team of 12 people reporting to me. The company had grown from barely surviving to becoming one of the most reliable industrial equipment distributors in the Rocky Mountain region. Our annual revenue had increased by over 400% since my arrival, and we'd expanded our client base from 43 local businesses to over 300 companies across 6 states. But success, I learned, can be a double-edged sword. The better Pinnacle performed, the more attractive it became to outside investors. Robert, now in his 70s and ready to retire, began entertaining offers from corporate acquisition firms. 3 years ago, he sold the company to Whitfield Industries, a larger manufacturing conglomerate based in Chicago. The transition was supposed to be smooth, with assurances that existing management would remain in place and current operations would continue unchanged. Marcus Whitfield, the new CEO and son of Whitfield Industries founder, had different plans. At 52, he was everything Robert wasn't. Slick, corporate, and obsessed with what he called optimization through modernization. He wore expensive suits that probably cost more than most of our warehouse workers made in a month, and he had a habit of using buzzwords like synergistic solutions and disruptive innovation in every conversation. From day one, Marcus made it clear that he viewed the existing systems I'd built as outdated relics that needed to be replaced with cutting-edge technology solutions. He brought in consultants who spent weeks analyzing our operations, asking questions about processes they clearly didn't understand, and recommending changes that would have destroyed the very relationships that made our business successful. I tried to explain to Marcus why certain vendor relationships were crucial, why our clients valued personal service over automated systems, and why the trust we'd built over nearly 2 decades couldn't be replaced by algorithms and chatbots. But Marcus had already made up his mind about the direction he wanted to take the company, and it didn't include respecting the foundation that someone else had built. The first major red flag came 18 months ago when Marcus hired Tyler Brooks, a 28-year-old MBA graduate from Northwestern who'd never worked a day in manufacturing but had impressive credentials in digital transformation. Tyler was everything Marcus thought the company needed: young, tech-savvy, and full of ideas about how to revolutionize our operations through automation and artificial intelligence. Tyler's arrival marked the beginning of what I now recognize as a systematic campaign to undermine my authority and prepare for my eventual removal. It started subtly. Marcus would schedule meetings about operational changes without inviting me, then present decisions that had been made about my own department. Tyler began inserting himself into conversations with long-term clients, positioning himself as the future of Pinnacle's customer relations. Vendors who had worked exclusively with me for years suddenly found themselves redirected to Tyler for streamlined communication. I watched as Tyler attempted to implement improvements that I knew would damage our carefully cultivated relationships. He proposed replacing our personalized vendor negotiations with automated procurement software. He suggested transitioning all client communications to a ticketing system that would eliminate direct phone contact. He even recommended outsourcing our inventory management to a third-party logistics company, completely dismantling the systems I'd spent years perfecting. Each of these suggestions would have saved the company money in the short term, while destroying the trust and reliability that had made us successful. But Marcus was mesmerized by Tyler's presentations, complete with colorful charts and projected cost savings that looked impressive on paper but ignored the intangible value of established relationships. I began documenting everything. Every email, every meeting summary, every decision that was made without my input despite affecting my department. I kept detailed records of client feedback, vendor concerns, and operational metrics that demonstrated the real-world impact of the changes Tyler was implementing. More importantly, I began to understand just how crucial my knowledge and relationships were to the company's continued success. Over the past 20 years, I hadn't just managed operations. I had become the institutional memory of Pinnacle manufacturing. I knew which vendors would extend payment terms during cash flow challenges, which clients had seasonal fluctuations that required adjusted delivery schedules, and which suppliers could be trusted to prioritize our orders during industry shortages. I had personal relationships with decision-makers at companies that represented millions of dollars in annual revenue. What Marcus and Tyler didn't realize was that most of these relationships existed because of personal trust in me, not corporate loyalty to Pinnacle. Vendors had my personal cell phone number and would call me directly when issues arose. Clients specifically requested to work with me on major orders, because they knew I would personally ensure everything went smoothly. Suppliers often gave us preferential pricing and priority treatment because of years of honest dealing and mutual respect. 6 months ago, I started noticing that Marcus was having private conversations with Tyler about restructuring opportunities and leadership transitions. I overheard a phone call where Marcus discussed optimizing personnel costs and transitioning to next-generation management. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was highlighted, underlined, and circled in red. That's when I began preparing for what I knew was inevitable. I started reaching out to my network, not to find a new job, but to understand what my departure would really mean for Pinnacle's business relationships. The conversations I had were enlightening and, frankly, empowering. 3 weeks ago, Marcus asked me to prepare a comprehensive transition document, outlining all of my operational responsibilities, vendor contacts, and client relationship histories.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He presented it as a quote, succession planning exercise designed to ensure business continuity. I knew exactly what it really was, a roadmap for replacing me. So I gave him exactly what he asked for, with one crucial omission. The document contained detailed process descriptions and contact information, but it didn't include the personal relationships, the unwritten agreements, the favors owed, and debts of trust that really made everything work. 2 weeks ago, Tyler started attending client meetings that I'd been managing for years, introducing himself as the new primary contact for operational excellence. Several clients called me privately afterward, expressing confusion and concern about the transition. I reassured them that I would make sure their needs continued to be met, without mentioning that my time at Pinnacle was likely coming to an end. Last week, I had lunch with Patricia Hendricks, the procurement director at Rocky Mountain Industrial, our largest client worth over $2 million in annual revenue. Patricia had worked with me for 12 years and trusted my recommendations implicitly. During our conversation, she mentioned that Tyler had reached out to discuss optimizing their supplier relationship through enhanced digital interfaces. "Chloe," Patricia said, leaning across the table with concern in her voice, "I hope you know that our contract with Pinnacle is really a contract with you. If you ever decide to move on, I'd want to know where you're going, because that's where Rocky Mountain Industrial's business will follow." Similar conversations with other major clients revealed the same sentiment. They weren't loyal to Pinnacle Manufacturing. They were loyal to me and the level of service I provided. The company that Marcus thought he was optimizing was actually held together by relationships he didn't understand and couldn't replicate. Yesterday morning, I received a call from Janet Morrison at Summit Supply Solutions, one of our key vendors for specialized industrial components. Janet had been dealing with Tyler for the past month as he attempted to renegotiate their contract terms to achieve, quote, optimal pricing structures. "Chloe, I need to ask you something directly," Janet said. "Is Tyler Brooks speaking for you when he says that Pinnacle wants to change our payment terms and implement automated ordering systems? Because if that's really the direction you want to go, we need to have a very different conversation about our partnership." I assured Janet that any changes to their vendor relationship would be discussed with her personally before implementation. But after hanging up, I realized that Marcus and Tyler were moving faster than I'd anticipated. They weren't just planning to replace me. They were already trying to restructure the fundamental relationships that I'd built and that kept the company profitable. That evening, I did something I'd never done in 20 years of employment. I opened my laptop and began documenting every single relationship, agreement, and operational detail that wasn't captured in any company database. I created a comprehensive list of which vendors offered us special terms, which clients had specific service requirements, and which suppliers could be relied upon during emergencies. More importantly, I made note of which of these relationships were tied to me personally, rather than to Pinnacle as a company. The picture that emerged was both sobering and empowering. Over the past 2 decades, I had become the central hub through which nearly every important business relationship flowed. Removing me from the equation wouldn't just create an operational gap, it would potentially collapse the entire network that made Pinnacle successful. So when my phone buzzed at 6:47 this morning with Marcus's termination email, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. The email was brief and corporate, thanking me for my years of service while explaining that the company was moving in a new direction that requires different operational leadership. My final day would be today, and Tyler Brooks would be assuming responsibility for all operational functions immediately. I read the email twice, then set my phone aside and finished my coffee. After 20 years of building something remarkable, I was about to find out just how much my work had really been worth. Marcus and Tyler thought they were getting rid of a problem. They had no idea they were about to discover just how essential I had been to everything they were about to lose. Within an hour of receiving that termination email, my phone started ringing. The first call came from Dennis Murphy at Mountain States Equipment, one of our mid-tier suppliers who specialized in hydraulic components. Dennis had been working with me for 8 years, and his company provided about 15% of our specialty inventory. "Chloe, I just got the strangest call from some kid named Tyler," Dennis said, his voice carrying that particular tone of confusion that I'd been expecting. "He says he's taking over your accounts and wants to renegotiate our pricing structure immediately. He's talking about implementing some kind of automated ordering system and cutting our payment terms from 60 days to 30. Is this kid serious?" I leaned back in my kitchen chair, looking out at the Denver skyline through my apartment window. "Dennis, I'm no longer with Pinnacle as of this morning. Tyler Brooks is apparently my replacement, though I suspect he hasn't been fully briefed on the details of our vendor relationships." The silence on Dennis's end stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "You're not with Pinnacle anymore?" Chloe, you are Pinnacle. What the hell happened? Corporate restructuring, I said simply. New management has different ideas about how operations should run. Well, that's just fantastic, Dennis muttered. This Tyler character doesn't seem to understand that the terms we've negotiated with you aren't standard pricing. We've been giving Pinnacle preferred rates because of our relationship. If he wants to play hardball with contracts, he's going to get our standard commercial rates, which are about 22% higher than what you've been paying. This was exactly what I'd anticipated. Dennis wasn't being vindictive. He was being realistic. The preferential pricing his company offered wasn't based on Pinnacle's credit rating or order volume. It was based on 8 years of honest dealing, prompt payment, and mutual respect that I'd cultivated through countless phone calls, facility visits, and personal attention to his company's needs. I understand completely, I told Dennis. You need to do what's best for your business. Where are you going to end up? He asked. Because I'll tell you right now, if you start working with one of Pinnacle's competitors, Mountain States would be very interested in discussing how we might continue our partnership. The second call came 20 minutes later from Angela Rodriguez at Precision Industrial Solutions, our largest supplier of custom manufactured components. Angela's company handled nearly 30% of our specialty orders, often working directly with our clients to design and produce one-off pieces that required significant engineering expertise. Chloe, please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding, Angela began without preamble. I just spent 45 minutes on the phone with Tyler Brooks, and it was the most frustrating conversation I've had in years. He wants to standardize our entire product line and eliminate custom orders, because they're inefficient and difficult to scale. He clearly doesn't understand what our companies do together. Angela's concern was entirely justified. Precision Industrial Solutions had developed a specialized manufacturing process specifically to meet Pinnacle's unique requirements. Over the years, we'd collaborated on dozens of custom projects that had generated millions of dollars in revenue for both companies. The relationship went far beyond simple vendor and customer. We were true business partners. He also mentioned something about bringing manufacturing in-house to reduce costs. Angela continued. Chloe, you know as well as I do that Pinnacle doesn't have the equipment, expertise, or facility space to handle the kind of specialized work we do. Is Marcus Whitfield completely out of his mind? I found myself in the unusual position of defending my former employer while secretly agreeing with every word Angela said. I think the new management team is still learning about the complexities of our industry relationships. Learning? Angela's voice rose slightly. Chloe, we have 6 active projects in production right now worth over $400,000. Tyler wants to put all of them on hold while he evaluates the cost-benefit analysis of outsourced manufacturing. He doesn't seem to understand that stopping production midstream will cost both companies significantly more than completing the work as planned. The third call came from Patricia Hendricks at Rocky Mountain Industrial, the client I'd had lunch with just last week. Patricia managed procurement for a company that represented over $2 million in annual revenue for Pinnacle, making them our single largest client account. Chloe, I need to understand what's happening over there, Patricia said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who controlled a substantial business relationship. Tyler Brooks just sent me an email proposing to transition our entire account to what he calls a digital-first service model. He wants to replace our direct communication with some kind of online portal system and eliminate our quarterly planning meetings. This was worse than I'd expected. The quarterly planning meetings with Rocky Mountain Industrial weren't just routine check-ins. They were strategic sessions where we coordinated their upcoming projects, discussed potential challenges, and planned inventory requirements months in advance. These meetings had prevented countless problems and had been instrumental in building the trust that made our partnership so successful. He also mentioned that Pinnacle is implementing standardized pricing structures across all client accounts, Patricia continued. Chloe, you know our contract includes negotiated rates based on our annual volume commitments. Is Pinnacle planning to honor those agreements or not? I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Tyler was apparently attempting to restructure every significant relationship Pinnacle had, all at the same time, without understanding the legal and financial implications of the changes he was proposing. Patricia, I'm no longer with Pinnacle as of this morning, so I can't speak to their current contract policies. You'll need to work directly with Tyler on any questions about your agreement. The silence that followed was deafening. You're not with Pinnacle anymore? Patricia's voice carried a note of disbelief. Chloe, you've been managing our account for 12 years. You understand our business better than most of our own employees. Who's going to handle the coordination for our fall expansion project? The fall expansion project was a $800,000 initiative that Rocky Mountain Industrial had been planning for 18 months. I'd been working with their engineering team to coordinate the specialized equipment requirements, timing deliveries to match their construction schedule, and managing the complex logistics involved in supplying a project of that scope. The success of the project depended on precise coordination and deep understanding of both companies' capabilities and limitations. I assume Tyler will be taking over all client relationships, I said carefully. This is unacceptable, Patricia said firmly. I'm going to need to speak with Marcus Whitfield directly. Rocky Mountain Industrial has been one of Pinnacle's most loyal clients, and we expect a certain level of service continuity. If that's not possible, we'll need to explore other options. By noon, I'd received 11 similar calls from vendors, suppliers, and clients, all expressing confusion, concern, and frustration about the sudden changes Tyler was attempting to implement. The pattern was consistent across every conversation. Tyler was treating established relationships as simple transactional arrangements that could be modified or replaced without consequence. But the most revealing call came from Janet Morrison at Summit Supply Solutions, the vendor who had raised concerns about Tyler's negotiation tactics just yesterday. Janet's company provided specialized electronic components that were crucial for about 40% of our products, and they'd been giving Pinnacle preferred treatment for over a decade. Chloe, I need to tell you something that happened this morning, Janet said, her voice carrying a tone of barely controlled anger. Tyler Brooks called me at 8:30 and informed me that Summit Supply Solutions would need to accept new contract terms or lose Pinnacle's business entirely. He gave me until end of business today to agree to a 15% price reduction and immediate implementation of their new automated ordering system. This was corporate negotiation at its worst. Ultimatums delivered without understanding the relationship dynamics or market realities involved. Summit Supply Solutions hadn't just been providing components to Pinnacle. They'd been providing expertise, rush delivery when needed, and quality guarantees that went far beyond standard supplier obligations. Janet, Tyler doesn't have the background to understand the value Summit brings to our relationship, I said. That's exactly the problem, Janet replied. He kept talking about optimizing supplier networks, and eliminating inefficiencies in procurement processes. When I tried to explain that our pricing reflects the additional services we provide, like emergency delivery, technical support, and quality testing, he said those services were unnecessary overhead that modern systems could eliminate. Janet paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. Chloe, I've been in this business for 25 years. I know the difference between a partnership and a transaction. What Tyler is proposing isn't a business relationship. It's a race to the bottom that will hurt both companies. Summit Supply Solutions isn't going to participate in that kind of arrangement. What are you going to do? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. I'm declining Tyler's new terms, Janet said firmly. If Pinnacle wants to work with suppliers who compete solely on price with no added value, they can find plenty of options. But they won't get the level of service and reliability they've been receiving from us. And frankly, after this conversation, I'm questioning whether Pinnacle is the kind of company Summit wants to continue working with at all. That afternoon, I received a call that I hadn't expected. Marcus Whitfield's assistant, Rebecca, reached out to schedule an exit interview for later in the week. The timing struck me as odd, since most companies conduct exit interviews before terminating employees, not after sending dismissal emails. Mr. Whitfield would like to discuss the transition process and ensure that all operational knowledge is properly transferred to Tyler Brooks, Rebecca explained in her professionally neutral tone. I almost laughed at the irony. Marcus wanted to extract 20 years of institutional knowledge from someone he'd just fired via email. The arrogance was staggering, but it also represented an opportunity. "I'd be happy to meet with Mr. Whitfield," I told Rebecca. "However, given that my employment has been terminated, I should mention that consulting services for knowledge transfer would be billed at my standard rate of $200 per hour, with a minimum of 4 hours per session." The pause on Rebecca's end suggested that she hadn't expected this response. "I'll need to discuss the consulting arrangement with Mr. Whitfield and get back to you." 20 minutes later, Rebecca called back to confirm that Marcus had agreed to the consulting terms for a 2-hour session on Thursday afternoon. The fact that he'd agreed so quickly told me everything I needed to know about how badly the transition was already going. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine and spent the evening thinking about my future instead of worrying about work. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely relaxed. The constant stress of watching Tyler undermine systems I'd built, the frustration of seeing Marcus ignore advice based on 2 decades of experience, the exhaustion of trying to protect relationships that weren't being valued. All of it was finally over. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening. Dennis Murphy sent a message asking if I was interested in discussing future business opportunities. Angela Rodriguez wanted to know if I'd be available for lunch next week to talk about potential collaborations. Patricia Hendricks sent a formal email requesting my personal contact information for ongoing consultation on industrial procurement matters. By Wednesday morning, the situation at Pinnacle had apparently deteriorated significantly. I received a voicemail from Tyler Brooks that lasted nearly 3 minutes, during which he alternated between frustrated and desperate as he described, quote, communication challenges with several key vendors. Quote, "Chloe, I know you're no longer with the company, but I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand why Summit Supply Solutions is refusing to honor their existing contract," Tyler's message began. "They're claiming that the terms we've negotiated were personal agreements with you, rather than corporate contracts with Pinnacle. That doesn't make sense from a legal standpoint, and I need to resolve this situation quickly because we have pending orders that depend on their components." Tyler's confusion was understandable but misguided. While Summit Supply Solutions did have a formal contract with Pinnacle, the preferential terms and flexible arrangements weren't written into the legal document. They were based on relationship dynamics and trust that had been built through years of reliable partnership. Janet Morrison had honored those arrangements because she trusted me to honor Pinnacle's commitments in return. "I've also been trying to reach Patricia Hendricks at Rocky Mountain Industrial," Tyler continued, "but she's not returning my calls. Her assistant says she's only available to discuss the fall expansion project with you directly. I don't understand why a client would refuse to work with their designated account manager." Again, Tyler was missing the fundamental reality of how business relationships actually work. Patricia wasn't refusing to work with Pinnacle's account manager out of spite. She was protecting an $800,000 project by insisting on working with someone who understood the complexity and stakes involved. "If you could call me back and maybe help smooth over some of these vendor and client relationships, I'd really appreciate it," Tyler concluded. "I'm sure we can work out some kind of consulting arrangement." I deleted the voicemail without returning the call. Tyler's problems weren't my responsibility anymore, and attempting to smooth over relationships that he was actively damaging would be both futile and professionally unethical. Wednesday afternoon brought news that I'd been anticipating but still found satisfying. Angela Rodriguez called to inform me that Precision Industrial Solutions had formally notified Pinnacle that they would not be accepting Tyler's proposed changes to their manufacturing partnership. "We sent a certified letter this morning," Angela explained. "Tyler's demands would require us to completely restructure our production processes, eliminate custom manufacturing capabilities, and accept payment terms that would create serious cash flow problems. Precision Industrial Solutions isn't willing to fundamentally change our business model to accommodate Pinnacle's new operational philosophy." "What does that mean for the current projects you have in production?" I asked. "We're honoring our commitments for all work that's already in progress," Angela replied. "But we won't be accepting new orders under the terms Tyler is proposing. If Pinnacle wants to continue working with us, they'll need to return to the partnership model we've had for the past several years." This was the first major crack in Pinnacle's supplier network, but I suspected it wouldn't be the last. Angela's company wasn't being unreasonable. They were simply refusing to accept terms that would damage their own business in order to satisfy Marcus's efficiency initiatives. "Angela, Can I ask you something? I said. If someone were to start a new industrial procurement and operations consulting business, would that be something Precision Industrial Solutions might be interested in working with? The enthusiasm in Angela's voice was immediate and obvious. Chloe, if you're thinking about going into business for yourself, Precision would absolutely be interested in that conversation. Your understanding of industrial operations and client relationships is exactly what companies in our industry need. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected development. I received a call from Robert Pinnacle, the original owner who had sold the company to Marcus 3 years earlier. Robert was in his mid-70s now, enjoying retirement in Arizona, but he still maintained connections throughout the Denver industrial community. Chloe, I heard through the grapevine that Marcus let you go, Robert said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and disappointment. I have to tell you that news has been making rounds in some pretty influential circles, and the reaction hasn't been positive. Robert had always been direct in his communication style, a trait that had made working with him both challenging and rewarding during my early years at Pinnacle. People in this industry remember when Pinnacle was struggling. Robert continued. They remember how you turned that company around and made it into something worth buying. Marcus seems to have forgotten that the value he acquired wasn't just in equipment and facilities, it was in relationships and expertise that took decades to build. The industry is smaller than people realize, I said. Word travels fast when significant changes happen. That's exactly right, Robert agreed. And the word that's traveling isn't favorable to Marcus or his management decisions. I've had 3 different company executives ask me if you're available for consulting work. There's a lot of respect for what you accomplished at Pinnacle, and people want to work with you, not with some corporate restructuring program. Robert's call reinforced something I'd been realizing over the past few days. My value in the industrial procurement industry wasn't tied to Pinnacle manufacturing. It was tied to the knowledge, relationships, and reputation I'd built over 20 years of successful work. Marcus had treated me as a replaceable employee when I was actually an irreplaceable asset. Robert, can I ask you a hypothetical question? I said. If someone with extensive operational experience wanted to start an independent consulting practice, what would be the biggest challenges they'd face in this industry? Honestly, Robert chuckled, the biggest challenge would be managing the demand. Good operational consultants are rare in this business, and someone with your track record would probably have more opportunities than they could handle. That afternoon, I drove to Pinnacle's offices for my consulting meeting with Marcus. The building looked the same from the outside, but walking through the front doors felt strange after 20 years of coming to work there every day. The receptionist, Maria, looked surprised and pleased to see me. Chloe, I heard you were leaving, but I didn't believe it. You've been here longer than anyone except Mr. Pinnacle himself. Are you really not coming back? Afraid not, Maria. I'm just here for a brief consulting meeting with Marcus. Maria's expression shifted to something that looked like concern. Things have been pretty chaotic around here since Tuesday. Tyler's been running around trying to handle vendor calls, and there have been some pretty heated conversations behind closed doors. I made my way to Marcus's office, noting that several of my former team members looked up from their desks with expressions of confusion and worry. Tyler was nowhere to be seen, though I could hear his voice from behind a closed conference room door, apparently engaged in what sounded like a difficult phone conversation. Marcus greeted me with the kind of forced professional smile that people use when they're trying to pretend that awkward situations aren't actually awkward. Chloe, thank you for coming in. I know this transition has been abrupt, but I'm hoping we can ensure that all critical, operational knowledge is properly transferred to Tyler. I'm happy to help however I can, I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. What specific information are you looking for? Marcus pulled out a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. Tyler has been having some difficulty with vendor communications. Several suppliers seem to be questioning contract terms that we thought were already established. Can you help us understand what might be causing the confusion? This was the moment I'd been preparing for since receiving that termination email. Marcus was asking me to solve problems that had been created by decisions he'd made, without understanding their implications. The vendor relationships that Pinnacle has benefited from over the years are based on trust and mutual benefit that goes beyond written contracts, I explained. Many suppliers have been providing preferential treatment, better pricing, priority delivery, flexible terms, because of long-term partnerships that took years to develop. Marcus nodded, making notes. Right, but those arrangements should be transferable to new management, correct? Not necessarily, I said carefully. Business relationships in this industry are often personal. Vendors work with people they trust, not just with companies. When you change the people they're working with, especially if you also want to change the terms of the relationship, you're essentially asking them to start over with a new partnership. But we have contracts, Marcus insisted. Legal obligations that suppliers need to honor regardless of personnel changes. The contracts establish minimum requirements. I agreed. But the value that Pinnacle has been receiving goes well beyond those minimum requirements. Suppliers have been providing additional services, better pricing, and more flexible arrangements because of relationships that took time to build. Marcus looked frustrated, which told me that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd hoped. So what you're saying is that Tyler needs to rebuild all of these relationships from scratch? Tyler needs to understand that relationship building takes time and requires a different approach than contract management. I replied, you can't demand the same level of service and preferential treatment that comes from years of partnership when you're starting fresh with new personnel and new terms. This is ridiculous, Marcus said, his professional demeanor slipping slightly. We're the customer. Suppliers should want to work with us regardless of who's managing the relationship. This comment revealed exactly why Marcus had been so wrong about the transition. He viewed vendor relationships as simple customer-supplier transactions, where Pinnacle's money automatically guaranteed service and compliance. He didn't understand that the best suppliers in the industry had multiple customers competing for their attention, and they prioritized relationships that were mutually beneficial and professionally satisfying. Marcus, suppliers in this industry choose their customers just as much as customers choose their suppliers, I explained. The best vendors work with companies that treat them as partners, rather than just service providers. They provide better terms and more flexible arrangements to customers who understand their business constraints and work collaboratively to solve problems. And you're saying Tyler doesn't understand this approach? I'm saying that rebuilding 20 years of relationship equity takes time, and trying to restructure multiple partnerships simultaneously while demanding better terms is probably not the most effective strategy. Marcus set down his pen and looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. Chloe, I'm going to be frank with you. This transition has been more difficult than we anticipated. Tyler is capable, but he's struggling with the complexity of these vendor relationships. Would you be willing to stay on as a consultant for a few months to help smooth things over? This was the question I'd been expecting, and I'd already decided on my answer. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that would be the best solution for anyone involved. Why not? You understand these relationships better than anyone. Because the problems Tyler is facing aren't technical issues that can be solved with consulting, I said. They're the result of fundamental changes in how Pinnacle approaches business partnerships. Vendors and clients are responding to a shift in company culture and priorities, not just personnel changes. Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated by my response. So what would you recommend? I'd recommend that Tyler take time to understand why the existing relationships worked before trying to change them, I said. Talk to vendors about what they value in the partnership. Ask clients what service elements are most important to their operations. Build trust before proposing changes. That could take months, Marcus protested. It took me years to build some of these relationships, I replied. There's no shortcut for earning trust and demonstrating reliability. As I left Marcus's office, I passed the conference room where Tyler was still on the phone. Through the glass door, I could see him gesturing emphatically while speaking into his headset, apparently engaged in another difficult conversation with a vendor or client. Maria stopped me at the reception desk on my way out. Chloe, can I ask you something? Is the company going to be okay? People are worried about their jobs. And there are rumors that some of our biggest clients are considering other suppliers. I looked around the office that had been my professional home for 2 decades. The same desks where I'd trained dozens of employees. The conference room where I'd negotiated countless deals. The break room where I'd celebrated successes and worked through challenges with colleagues who had become friends. Maria, change is always difficult, but good people find ways to adapt, I said. The industry will always need skilled operational professionals, regardless of what happens with specific companies. It wasn't a direct answer to her question, but it was the most honest response I could give. The truth was that Pinnacle Manufacturing was about to discover just how much of their success had been tied to relationships and expertise that couldn't be easily replaced. Friday morning brought the call I'd been waiting for. Marcus Whitfield's voice on the other end of the line carried a tone I'd never heard from him before, something between desperation and barely controlled panic. Chloe, we need to talk. Can you come in today? This is urgent. I was sitting in my home office, reviewing business formation documents I'd downloaded from the Colorado Secretary of State's website. The idea of starting my own consulting practice had evolved from a distant possibility to a concrete plan over the past week, and I'd spent Thursday evening researching the legal and financial requirements for establishing an independent business. I'm available for consulting services, Marcus. My rate is still $200 per hour with a 4-hour minimum. Yes, fine, whatever. Can you be here in an hour? The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, but I wasn't about to rearrange my schedule to accommodate Pinnacle's crisis management. I can be there at 2 o'clock this afternoon. This can't wait until 2 o'clock, Marcus said, his professional composure slipping further. We have a situation that needs immediate attention. Then I suggest you work with Tyler to address it. I replied calmly. He's your operations manager now. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice strained. Tyler is part of the problem. 2 o'clock will have to work. When I arrived at Pinnacle's offices that afternoon, the atmosphere was noticeably different from my visit just 24 hours earlier. The usual buzz of productive activity had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension and uncertainty. Several employees looked up from their desks with expressions that seemed hopeful, as if my presence might signal a return to normalcy. Tyler was waiting in the lobby when I walked in, and he immediately approached me with the kind of eager desperation that suggested his week had not gone well. Chloe, thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. We have some serious issues that I could really use your help with. I'm here to meet with Marcus, I said politely, but firmly. Any consulting work would need to be arranged through him. Tyler's face flushed slightly. Right, of course. But maybe after your meeting with Marcus, we could sit down and discuss some of the vendor situations? I think there might be some miscommunications that you could help clarify. The fact that Tyler was characterizing the systematic breakdown of Pinnacle's supplier relationships as miscommunications told me everything I needed to know about how little he understood the situation he'd created. Marcus's office door was closed when I arrived, but I could hear raised voices from inside. Through the glass, I could see Marcus on the phone, gesturing emphatically while someone else spoke. Rebecca, his assistant, motioned for me to take a seat in the waiting area. He's been on crisis calls all morning, Rebecca said quietly. Rocky Mountain Industrial, Summit Supply Solutions, and 3 other major accounts. It's been pretty intense. The door to Marcus's office opened, and he emerged looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by visible stress. Chloe, thank you for coming. We need to discuss some urgent developments. I followed him into his office, noting that Tyler attempted to join us but was stopped by Marcus's firm gesture indicating this would be a private conversation. Marcus closed the door and immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. We've encountered some unexpected challenges with the operational transition. Several key vendors have raised concerns about contract modifications, and some clients are questioning our service continuity. I need your expertise to help resolve these issues quickly. What specific issues are you facing? I asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Marcus pulled out a folder thick with printed emails and documents. Summit Supply Solutions has terminated their contract with us. They claim that the terms Tyler proposed violate the spirit of our partnership agreement, and they're refusing to deliver components for 3 active projects. This was exactly what Janet Morrison had warned would happen. Summit Supply Solutions wasn't being vindictive. They were protecting their own business interests by refusing to accept terms that would compromise their service quality and financial stability. Rocky Mountain Industrial has put their fall expansion project on hold, Marcus continued, his voice becoming more strained. Patricia Hendricks is demanding that you personally manage the project, and she's threatening to cancel the contract if that's not possible. That's an $800,000 project, Chloe. What did you tell her? I asked. I explained that you're no longer with the company, but she insists that the project specifications were developed specifically around your operational expertise. She says no one else at Pinnacle understands the complexity of their requirements. Patricia was absolutely correct. The Rocky Mountain Industrial Expansion Project involved coordinating 14 different suppliers, managing a complex delivery schedule that had to align with their construction timeline, and ensuring that specialized equipment met exact technical specifications. I'd spent 6 months working with their engineering team to develop the project requirements, and the success of the initiative depended on precise coordination and deep understanding of both companies' capabilities. Angela Rodriguez at Precision Industrial Solutions has also suspended new orders. Marcus continued, flipping through his folder. She's willing to complete current projects, but she won't accept any new work under Tyler's proposed manufacturing arrangement. That represents about 30% of our specialty production capacity. And 3 other suppliers have requested meetings to discuss the future of their partnership with Pinnacle, Marcus added, making air quotes around the phrase. That's corporate speak for, we're considering terminating our relationship. I listened without interrupting as Marcus detailed the scope of the crisis that had developed in less than a week. Tyler's attempt to restructure multiple business relationships simultaneously had created a cascade of problems that threatened the fundamental stability of Pinnacle's operations. Here's what I need from you, Marcus said, finally getting to the purpose of our meeting. I need you to contact these vendors and clients directly. Explain that the proposed changes were premature and that Pinnacle is committed to maintaining the partnership arrangements that have been successful. Smooth things over so we can return to normal operations. This request revealed how completely Marcus misunderstood both the situation and my position. He wanted me to undo the damage that Tyler had caused by essentially repudiating the changes that Marcus himself had authorized. More importantly, he wanted me to use my personal relationships and professional reputation to solve problems for a company that had just terminated my employment. Marcus, I can't do that, I said simply. Why not? You have the relationships, you understand the vendor concerns. You could resolve these issues in a few phone calls. Because I no longer represent Pinnacle Manufacturing, I explained. Using my personal relationships with vendors and clients to solve your operational problems would be professionally inappropriate and potentially damaging to those relationships. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting to something approaching pleading. Chloe, I know we handled your departure poorly. The email termination was impersonal and didn't reflect the value you've brought to this company. But we need your help. Pinnacle is facing a crisis that could threaten our entire business. And whose decisions created this crisis? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air for several seconds before Marcus responded. Look, maybe Tyler moved too quickly with some of the operational changes. Maybe we should have consulted with you before implementing new vendor policies. But we can fix this if you help us stabilize the situation. Marcus, this isn't about moving too quickly, I said. This is about fundamental misunderstanding of how business relationships work in this industry. Tyler didn't just propose changes too rapidly. He proposed changes that demonstrated complete disregard for the value that these partnerships provide. So help us fix it, Marcus insisted. Come back as a consultant. Take over vendor relations while Tyler focuses on other operational areas. We'll pay you whatever rate you want. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. 1 week after terminating my employment via email, Marcus was offering to pay me consulting rates to perform the same work I'd been doing as an employee, because the person he'd chosen to replace me had proven incapable of maintaining the relationships that kept the company profitable. Marcus, even if I wanted to help, the vendors and clients you're having problems with have already made their decisions based on Tyler's communications. Calling them now to say that those communications don't represent Pinnacle's actual position would raise serious questions about your company's internal coordination and management competence. Marcus's face flushed with frustration. So what are you saying? That these relationships are just gone? That 20 years of business partnerships can be destroyed in 1 week? I'm saying that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, I replied. When Tyler contacted these companies and demanded immediate changes to established arrangements, he sent a clear message about how Pinnacle values their partnerships. Attempting to retract those demands now would look like panic management, not strategic planning. But you could explain the situation, Marcus pressed. Tell them that the changes were a mistake. That Pinnacle wants to return to the previous arrangements. And what happens the next time Tyler or someone else decides that those arrangements need to be optimized? I asked. These companies aren't just concerned about the specific changes Tyler proposed. They're concerned about working with a company that would make such drastic modifications without consultation or consideration for their business impact. Marcus sat back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. So what would you do if you were in my position? The question was interesting because it implied that Marcus was finally ready to acknowledge that his approach had been flawed. But it also suggested that he still didn't understand the fundamental nature of the problems he was facing. If I were in your position, I would start by having honest conversations with the vendors and clients who are questioning their relationships with Pinnacle, I said. Not to convince them to stay, but to understand what they need in order to feel confident about working with your company going forward. And then what? Then I would evaluate whether Pinnacle is willing and able to provide what they need, I continued. Some of these relationships might be salvageable if you're willing to demonstrate genuine commitment to partnership rather than just transactional efficiency. Others might be permanently damaged. Marcus was quiet for nearly a minute, apparently processing the implications of what I'd said. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a note of resignation. Chloe, I need to ask you something directly. Do you think Pinnacle can survive this situation? It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer. That depends on how many of your key relationships can be rebuilt, and how quickly you can establish operational stability with new suppliers for the relationships that can't be repaired. And what are the chances that we can rebuild these relationships? I thought about Janet Morrison's anger when Tyler had given her ultimatums. I considered Patricia Hendricks's insistence that she would only work with me on the fall expansion project. I reflected on Angela Rodriguez's decision to suspend new orders rather than compromise her company's manufacturing processes. Marcus, these aren't just business relationships, they're professional partnerships built on mutual respect and trust. When Tyler demanded that these companies fundamentally change their operations to accommodate Pinnacle's efficiency initiatives, he demonstrated a level of disregard for their business expertise that went beyond normal contract negotiations. So you think the relationships are irreparable? I think some of them might be salvageable if Pinnacle demonstrates genuine commitment to partnership and gives these companies time to rebuild confidence in your management approach, I said carefully. But that would require acknowledging that the changes Tyler proposed were inappropriate and committing to a different operational philosophy going forward. Marcus nodded slowly, apparently absorbing the implications of what I'd explained. And Tyler? Tyler is a capable analyst, but he doesn't have the industry experience or relationship skills necessary to manage complex vendor partnerships, I said. His MBA training taught him to optimize systems and processes, but it didn't teach him how to build trust or navigate the personal dynamics that make business relationships successful in this industry. So we need someone with your experience to rebuild these relationships? You need someone who understands that vendor and client relationships in the industrial equipment industry are partnerships that require time, trust, and mutual respect to develop, I replied. Whether that's me or someone else is less important than finding someone who approaches these relationships appropriately. Marcus was quiet again, apparently considering his options. Finally, he asked the question I'd been expecting since the beginning of our conversation. Chloe, would you consider coming back to Pinnacle? Not as a consultant, but as a permanent employee. Vice President of Operations, reporting directly to me. Full authority over vendor relations and client management. Whatever salary you want. The offer was generous and demonstrated how desperate Marcus had become. A week ago, he'd been confident that Tyler could modernize Pinnacle's operations and eliminate the inefficiencies he associated with my management approach. Now he was offering me a promotion and unlimited authority to fix the problems that approach had created. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in returning to Pinnacle. Why not? You could have complete control over operations. Tyler would report to you. You could rebuild these relationships and implement whatever systems you think are appropriate. Because the fundamental issue isn't Tyler's inexperience or the specific changes he proposed, I explained. The fundamental issue is that you don't trust or value the operational approach that made these relationships successful. You terminated me because you believed that my methods were outdated and inefficient. Offering me my job back now doesn't change that underlying perspective. Marcus's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine confusion. But you were successful. Pinnacle's operational performance improved dramatically under your management. Why would I think your methods were inefficient? Because you consistently supported Tyler's proposals to replace personal relationship management with automated systems, to prioritize cost savings over service quality, and to treat long-term partnerships as simple transactional arrangements. I replied. Those decisions reflected a fundamental disagreement with the operational philosophy that made Pinnacle successful. I was trying to modernize the company, Marcus protested, to implement best practices from other industries. And in the process, you ignored the specific requirements and relationship dynamics of this industry, I said. Manufacturing and industrial equipment distribution isn't the same as software development or financial services. The approaches that work in other industries don't necessarily translate to businesses that depend on specialized expertise and long-term partnerships. Quote, Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, apparently reflecting on the conversation. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that seemed genuinely remorseful. I think I may have made some serious mistakes, he said quietly. We all make mistakes, I replied. The important thing is learning from them and making better decisions going forward. What would you do if you were starting over? If you were building vendor and client relationships from scratch? It was an interesting question that suggested Marcus was finally beginning to understand the scope of the challenge he was facing. I would start by identifying companies that share Pinnacle's values and operational philosophy. Then I would invest time in understanding their business needs and constraints. I would focus on building trust through consistent performance and honest communication. And I would prioritize long-term partnership development over short-term cost optimization. How long would that take? Years, I said honestly. The relationships that Pinnacle benefited from didn't develop overnight. They were built through consistent performance, reliable communication, and mutual problem-solving over extended periods of time. Marcus nodded slowly, apparently beginning to grasp the magnitude of the task ahead of him. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you work with whatever vendors and clients are willing to work with you, and you demonstrate through your actions that Pinnacle is committed to being a reliable partner, I said. You focus on rebuilding trust rather than optimizing efficiency. Chloe, I know I can't undo the mistakes we've made, Marcus said finally. But if you're not willing to come back to Pinnacle, would you at least consider helping us develop a plan for moving forward? A roadmap for rebuilding these relationships? I looked at Marcus across his desk, seeing for the first time a man who genuinely understood the severity of the situation he'd created. The arrogance and corporate confidence had been replaced by something approaching humility, and his request for help seemed sincere rather than manipulative. Marcus, I'm willing to provide consulting services to help Pinnacle develop a strategic plan for vendor and client relationship management, I said. But I want to be clear about what that would and wouldn't include. What do you mean? I would help you understand why the current approach isn't working and what kinds of changes might be necessary to rebuild trust with your business partners, I explained. But I wouldn't contact vendors or clients directly on Pinnacle's behalf, and I wouldn't try to convince them to maintain relationships they're questioning. Those conversations need to happen between your current management team and your business partners. Marcus nodded eagerly. That would be incredibly helpful. When could we start? I could provide a written assessment and recommendations within 2 weeks, I said. But Marcus, you need to understand that implementing those recommendations would require fundamental changes in how Pinnacle approaches vendor and client relationships. It's not just about fixing Tyler's mistakes. It's about adopting a different operational philosophy. I understand, Marcus said. Whatever it takes. As I left Marcus's office, I passed Tyler in the hallway. He looked up from a stack of papers he was carrying, his expression hopeful. Chloe, did you and Marcus discuss the vendor situation? I've been working on some modified proposals that might address their concerns. I stopped and looked at Tyler directly. He was obviously intelligent and well-educated, and his intentions seemed genuine. But he was also completely out of his depth in an industry that required skills and experience he didn't possess. Tyler, can I give you some advice? Absolutely. I'd appreciate any insights you can share. Stop trying to modify your proposals and start listening to what the vendors are telling you about their business needs, I said. The problems you're facing aren't communication issues that can be solved with better presentations. They're fundamental disagreements about what constitutes a successful business partnership. Quote, Tyler's expression shifted to something that looked like confusion, but the proposals I've developed would save the company significant money while streamlining operational processes. Why wouldn't vendors want to participate in arrangements that benefit everyone? His question revealed exactly why he'd been so unsuccessful in his negotiations. Tyler genuinely believed that his proposals would benefit everyone involved, because he was analyzing them purely from a financial and operational efficiency perspective. He wasn't considering the impact on vendor business models, relationship dynamics, or long-term partnership sustainability. Tyler, efficiency and cost savings aren't the only factors that determine whether a business arrangement is beneficial, I explained. Vendors also need to consider how proposed changes would affect their own operations, their ability to serve other customers, and their long-term financial stability. But if the arrangements are more efficient, wouldn't that benefit everyone? Not necessarily, I said. Efficiency for one company might create inefficiency or additional costs for their partners. The key is finding arrangements that provide mutual benefit, not just optimizing one company's operations at the expense of their business partners. Tyler was quiet for a moment, apparently processing what I'd said. So how do I determine what arrangements would provide mutual benefit? You ask? I said simply. You have conversations with vendors about their business goals, their operational constraints, and their concerns about proposed changes. You treat them as partners whose expertise and perspective have value, rather than service providers who should accommodate whatever terms you prefer. That makes sense, Tyler said, nodding slowly. Could you help me understand how to have those kinds of conversations effectively? I looked at Tyler and saw a young professional who was intelligent enough to recognize that his approach hadn't been working but lacked the experience to understand what he should be doing differently. He deserved an honest answer about his prospects for success in his current role. Tyler, vendor relationship management in this industry requires experience and intuition that can't be learned quickly, I said. The vendors you're working with have decades of experience in their own businesses, and they can tell when someone doesn't understand the complexities of what they do. Building credibility with them takes time and demonstrated expertise. So what would you recommend? I would recommend focusing on internal operations and process improvement while someone with more industry experience handles vendor and client relationships, I said. Your analytical skills and efficiency expertise could be valuable in areas where relationship management isn't the primary requirement. Tyler's face showed disappointment, but also what looked like relief. You think I'm not capable of managing these relationships? I think you're capable of learning to manage them, but it would take years of industry experience to develop the expertise these vendors expect, I replied honestly. And Pinnacle doesn't have years to wait while you develop those skills. As I walked through the office toward the exit, I noticed that several employees were watching my interaction with Tyler. Their expressions suggested that they understood the significance of what was happening and were concerned about their own job security as the company struggled with operational instability. Maria, the receptionist, stopped me as I reached the lobby. Chloe, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Are you going to be okay? I mean, after 20 years here, it must be difficult to start over somewhere else. I smiled at Maria, appreciating her concern. Actually, Maria, I think I'm going to be more than okay. Sometimes losing a job can be an opportunity to discover possibilities you never considered before. Are you going to work for another company? I'm thinking about starting my own business, I said. Industrial operations consulting. There seems to be demand for that kind of expertise. Maria's eyes lit up. That sounds perfect for you. You always knew how to solve problems that other people couldn't figure out. As I drove home from Pinnacle's offices, I reflected on the conversation with Marcus and the brief exchange with Tyler. For the first time since receiving that termination email, I felt genuinely optimistic about my future. The past week had demonstrated that my expertise and relationships had real value in the marketplace, and the idea of working independently was becoming increasingly appealing. That evening, I called Angela Rodriguez at Precision Industrial Solutions to discuss the consulting opportunity she'd mentioned earlier in the week. "Chloe, I'm so glad you called," Angela said immediately. "I've been thinking about our conversation and I have a proposition for you." Angela's proposition turned out to be more substantial than I'd anticipated. She wanted Precision Industrial Solutions to become the anchor client for my new consulting practice, with a retainer agreement that would provide stable income while I developed additional business relationships. "Here's what I'm thinking," Angela explained during our phone call. Precision has been looking for an operational consultant who understands both manufacturing and client relationship management. Your expertise with industrial procurement and vendor coordination is exactly what we need to expand our business development capabilities. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Angela's offer would provide immediate financial stability, while allowing me to build an independent practice around the expertise I'd developed over 20 years at Pinnacle. More importantly, it would position me to work with other companies in the industry who are experiencing similar operational challenges. "What kind of scope are you considering?" I asked. "Initially, we'd want you to help us develop relationships with larger industrial clients who need specialized manufacturing services," Angela said. "Companies like Rocky Mountain Industrial, who have complex projects that require close coordination between engineering, manufacturing, and procurement teams." The mention of Rocky Mountain Industrial was particularly interesting, given that Patricia Hendricks had put their expansion project on hold, specifically because Tyler couldn't provide the level of service coordination they required. "Angela, I need to be transparent about something," I said. "Rocky Mountain Industrial was one of my key client relationships at Pinnacle, and they're currently experiencing service disruptions because of management changes there. If I work with Precision, there could be opportunities to collaborate on projects that Pinnacle might not be able to handle effectively." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Angela replied. "Patricia Hendricks called me yesterday asking if Precision would be interested in direct partnerships for their expansion project. She specifically mentioned that she was looking for manufacturing partners who could provide the kind of operational coordination that she used to get from you at Pinnacle. This development represented a significant shift in industry dynamics. Patricia wasn't just threatening to cancel Pinnacle's contract, she was actively exploring alternative arrangements that would bypass Pinnacle entirely. If Rocky Mountain Industrial established a direct relationship with Precision Industrial Solutions, they would no longer need Pinnacle's procurement and coordination services." "How would that arrangement work?" I asked. "Rocky Mountain would work directly with Precision for their specialized manufacturing requirements, and they'd want you to provide operational coordination and project management services," Angela explained. "Essentially, they'd get the same level of service they were receiving from Pinnacle, but through a partnership that gives them more control over the manufacturing process." The implications were staggering. Rocky Mountain Industrial's expansion project represented $800,000 in revenue for Pinnacle, but more importantly, it established Pinnacle as the preferred supplier for Rocky Mountain's ongoing operational needs. If that relationship moved to a direct partnership between Rocky Mountain and Precision, Pinnacle would lose not just the immediate project revenue, but also future opportunities with one of their largest clients. "Angela, that sounds like an excellent opportunity for both of our businesses," I said. "When would you want to start discussions?" "Patricia is available for lunch next Tuesday to discuss the project requirements. Would you be able to join us as a representative of my consulting team?" I almost laughed at the irony. A week ago, Marcus had terminated my employment because he believed Tyler could provide better operational management. Now, one of Pinnacle's largest clients was arranging meetings specifically to work with me through a competing supplier relationship. "I'll be there," I said. Monday morning brought another call from Marcus, but this time his tone was different. Instead of the desperation I'd heard on Friday, his voice carried a note of panic that suggested the weekend had brought additional bad news. "Chloe, We need to meet again immediately. The situation has deteriorated significantly since our conversation on Friday. I can schedule a consulting session for Thursday afternoon, I replied, maintaining my professional boundaries despite his obvious urgency. This can't wait until Thursday, Marcus insisted. Summit Supply Solutions has formally terminated their contract with us. Rocky Mountain Industrial has canceled their expansion project. And Angela Rodriguez just informed us that Precision Industrial Solutions will not be accepting any new orders from Pinnacle. Each of these developments had been predictable based on the conversations I'd had throughout the previous week, but hearing them announced as accomplished facts created a different emotional impact. In less than 2 weeks, Tyler's management approach had destroyed relationships that had taken years to build and represented millions of dollars in annual revenue. That sounds like a challenging situation, I said neutrally. Challenging? Marcus's voice rose slightly. Chloe, we're looking at a potential loss of over 40% of our revenue base. This isn't challenging. This is catastrophic. Marcus, I understand the gravity of the situation, but these are consequences of decisions that were made without considering the relationship dynamics I tried to explain to you, I said. I'm available to provide consulting services to help you develop a recovery strategy, but I can't undo damage that's already been done. What kind of recovery strategy? How do we get these relationships back? You probably don't, I said honestly. The companies that have terminated relationships with Pinnacle have made those decisions based on fundamental concerns about your operational approach and management competence. Attempting to convince them to reconsider would likely reinforce their perception that Pinnacle lacks strategic direction. Marcus was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation that I'd never heard from him before. So what are our options? Your options are to find new suppliers and clients willing to work with Pinnacle under Tyler's operational approach, or to make fundamental changes in your management philosophy and rebuild your reputation in the industry over time, I explained. Both options would require acknowledging that the current strategy isn't working. And Tyler? Tyler is a capable analyst, but vendor and client relationship management in this industry requires expertise and credibility that he doesn't possess, I said. Keeping him in his current role would signal to potential partners that Pinnacle hasn't learned from the recent problems. Are you saying we should fire Tyler? I'm saying you should evaluate whether Tyler's skills are appropriate for the responsibilities he's been given, I replied. There might be other roles within the company where his analytical abilities would be more valuable and less likely to damage business relationships. Marcus sighed heavily. Chloe, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you come back to Pinnacle? Full partnership in the business. Equity ownership. Complete authority over operations. Tyler would be reassigned to internal process improvement. The offer was even more generous than what Marcus had proposed on Friday, reflecting how desperate he'd become as the scope of Pinnacle's crisis became clear. But it also demonstrated that he still didn't understand why I wouldn't want to return to clean up problems that could have been avoided if my expertise had been valued in the first place. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but my answer is still no, I said. I've decided to start my own consulting practice, and I already have clients lined up. What clients? Marcus asked, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost suspicious. Industrial companies that need operational expertise and relationship management services, I replied without providing specifics. You're going to compete with Pinnacle? I'm going to provide consulting services to companies that value operational expertise, I said. Whether that creates competition with Pinnacle depends on how effectively Pinnacle serves its own clients. The truth was that I wasn't planning to compete with Pinnacle directly. My consulting practice would focus on helping companies improve their operational efficiency and vendor relationships, not on providing the same procurement and distribution services that Pinnacle offered. But if Pinnacle's clients chose to work with my consulting clients instead of continuing their relationships with Pinnacle, that would be a consequence of Pinnacle's own service failures, not competitive interference from me. When are you planning to start this consulting practice? Marcus asked. I'm already operational, I said. I filed the business registration documents this morning. This was true. I'd spent the weekend completing the legal requirements for establishing Reynolds Operations Consulting as a limited liability company in Colorado. The process had been surprisingly straightforward, and I was now officially an independent business owner for the first time in my career. "Chloe, I need to ask you something directly," Marcus said. "Are you working with any of the vendors or clients that have terminated their relationships with Pinnacle?" "Marcus, I'm providing consulting services to companies that request my expertise," I replied. "I'm not soliciting business from Pinnacle's vendors or clients, but I'm also not turning away opportunities that are offered to me." "But you understand that these companies are our vendors and clients. Working with them while they're in disputes with Pinnacle creates conflicts of interest. These companies were your vendors and clients," I corrected. "Most of them have terminated their relationships with Pinnacle, which means they're now free to work with other service providers. And my consulting work focuses on operational improvement, not on competing with Pinnacle's core business services." Marcus was quiet for a moment, apparently processing the implications of what I'd said. "So you're saying that if Rocky Mountain Industrial decides to work with your consulting practice, that's not a conflict of interest because they've canceled their contract with Pinnacle?" "I'm saying that if Rocky Mountain Industrial decides they need operational consulting services, they're free to hire whoever they think can best meet their needs," I replied. "Their decision to cancel their Pinnacle contract was based on service issues that had nothing to do with my consulting practice. But you could influence their decision about whether to work with Pinnacle in the future." "Marcus, I provide advice based on my professional expertise and my clients' best interests," I said. "If a client asks me whether they should work with a particular vendor or supplier, I'll give them honest recommendations based on that company's ability to meet their operational requirements." The conversation was revealing Marcus's growing understanding of just how much influence I actually had in the industry. For 3 years, he'd viewed me as an employee whose primary value was executing operational tasks efficiently. Now he was beginning to recognize that my relationships and expertise gave me significant influence over business decisions that could affect Pinnacle's future. "What would it take for you to recommend Pinnacle to your consulting clients?" Marcus asked. "Pinnacle would need to demonstrate that they can provide reliable service and maintain professional relationships with their business partners," I said. "The same criteria I'd apply to any vendor or supplier recommendation." "And you think we can't meet those criteria?" "I think Pinnacle needs to prove that they've learned from recent problems and made the management changes necessary to prevent similar issues in the future," I replied. "That would take time and consistent performance." "How much time?" "That depends on how quickly you can rebuild trust with the industry professionals who've been affected by recent decisions," I said. "Some relationships might be repairable within months. Others might take years, and some might be permanently damaged." Marcus was quiet again, apparently contemplating the timeline I described. Finally, he asked the question that I'd been expecting throughout our conversation. "If you were in my position, what would you do right now?" "I would focus on stabilizing the relationships you still have, rather than trying to rebuild the ones you've lost," I said. "Make sure your remaining vendors and clients feel valued and confident about Pinnacle's service capabilities. Then gradually work on developing new partnerships to replace the revenue you've lost." "And Tyler?" "Tyler should be reassigned to roles that match his skills and experience," I said. Continuing to have him manage vendor and client relationships would signal that Pinnacle hasn't learned from recent mistakes. "What roles would be appropriate for him?" "Internal process analysis, efficiency improvement, cost management. Areas where his analytical skills would be valuable but where relationship management isn't the primary requirement," I explained. "Tyler is intelligent and capable, but he needs to work in areas where his lack of industry experience won't create problems for your business partnerships." "And who would manage vendor and client relationships?" "You'd need to hire someone with extensive experience in industrial operations and relationship management," I said. "Someone who understands this industry and has credibility with the vendor and client community." "Someone like you?" "Someone with similar experience and expertise," I agreed. Though finding that person might be challenging, given how specialized these skills are. Marcus sighed heavily. "Chloe, you realize that you're describing a situation where Pinnacle's success depends on finding someone with your exact qualifications, while you're starting a competing business in the same industry." "I'm not starting a competing business," I corrected. "I'm providing consulting services that help companies improve their operations. If Pinnacle hires the right operational manager and demonstrates commitment to professional relationship management, There's no reason we couldn't work together on projects that benefit both companies. But if Pinnacle can't find the right operational manager, then Pinnacle will continue to struggle with vendor and client relationships, and companies in this industry will look for alternative service providers, I said simply. The implications of this statement were clear to both of us. If Pinnacle couldn't rebuild its operational credibility, companies like Rocky Mountain Industrial would establish direct relationships with suppliers like Precision Industrial Solutions, bypassing Pinnacle entirely. My consulting practice would facilitate those direct relationships, essentially replacing Pinnacle's role in the supply chain. So you're saying that Pinnacle's survival depends on decisions I make in the next few weeks? I'm saying that Pinnacle's survival depends on convincing the industrial community that your company has learned from recent mistakes and is committed to professional relationship management going forward, I replied. The decisions you make about management and operational approach will determine whether that's possible. Tuesday's lunch meeting with Angela Rodriguez and Patricia Hendricks exceeded my expectations in every way. Patricia arrived with detailed project specifications and a clear vision of how she wanted the Rocky Mountain industrial expansion to proceed. I've been thinking about this situation over the weekend. Patricia began as soon as we'd ordered. The problems with Pinnacle aren't just about Tyler's inexperience. They're about a fundamental change in company culture that makes me question whether they're the right partner for complex projects. Angela nodded in agreement. We've noticed similar issues with other clients who've worked with Pinnacle recently. The personal attention and relationship focus that made them successful seems to have been replaced by automated systems and efficiency metrics. That's exactly right, Patricia said. For 12 years, I could call Chloe directly when issues arose, and I knew they'd be resolved quickly and professionally. Now I'm supposed to submit tickets through an online portal and wait for responses from someone who doesn't understand our operational requirements. This conversation was revealing how Tyler's operational changes had affected the day-to-day experience of working with Pinnacle. What Marcus had viewed as modernization and efficiency improvement, clients had experienced as reduced service quality and diminished relationship value. So what are you thinking for the expansion project? I asked Patricia. I want to work directly with Precision for manufacturing and have you provide operational coordination and project management, Patricia replied. Rocky Mountain would have a direct relationship with our suppliers, better control over the manufacturing process, and access to the level of expertise we need for complex projects. Angela looked pleased with this arrangement. Precision has the manufacturing capabilities to handle Rocky Mountain's requirements, and working with Chloe would give us access to the operational expertise that makes complex projects successful. What about ongoing procurement needs? I asked. That's where your consulting practice would be particularly valuable, Patricia said. Rocky Mountain needs someone who understands our operational requirements and can help us develop direct relationships with reliable suppliers. We'd rather work with a consultant who represents our interests than with a distributor who's focused on their own efficiency metrics. The lunch meeting concluded with agreements that would fundamentally reshape how Rocky Mountain Industrial approached their supplier relationships. Instead of working through Pinnacle as an intermediary, they would establish direct partnerships with manufacturing companies like Precision, while using my consulting services to coordinate complex projects and develop new supplier relationships. This arrangement would provide Rocky Mountain with better control over their supply chain, give them access to specialized expertise when needed, and potentially reduce their overall procurement costs by eliminating distributor markups. For Precision Industrial Solutions, it would provide access to larger clients and more complex projects that wouldn't have been available through their previous vendor relationships. For Pinnacle Manufacturing, the implications were devastating. Rocky Mountain Industrial represented over $2 million in annual revenue, and losing them would create a significant financial impact. More importantly, if other large clients followed Rocky Mountain's example and established direct supplier relationships, Pinnacle's role as an intermediary would become increasingly irrelevant. That afternoon, I received a call from Dennis Murphy at Mountain States Equipment, the hydraulic components supplier who'd been one of the first to express concerns about Tyler's negotiation approach. Chloe, I heard through the industry grapevine that you've started your own consulting practice, Dennis said. I wanted to talk to you about some opportunities we might be able to work on together. What kind of opportunities? I asked. Mountain States has been looking to expand our client base, particularly with larger industrial companies that need specialized hydraulic systems, Dennis explained. We've got the manufacturing capabilities, but we don't have the industry relationships and operational expertise to approach companies like Rocky Mountain Industrial or Colorado Engineering Solutions. And you think my consulting practice could help with that? I think your understanding of how these companies operate and what they look for in supplier relationships could be invaluable for developing new business, Dennis said. We'd be interested in retaining your services to help us identify potential clients and develop relationship strategies. This represented another opportunity to work with former Pinnacle vendors in arrangements that would bypass Pinnacle entirely. Mountain States Equipment had the manufacturing capabilities to serve large industrial clients directly, but they needed operational expertise and industry relationships to make those connections effectively. Dennis, that sounds like an interesting collaboration, I said. Let me think about how we might structure that kind of consulting arrangement. There's something else you should know, Dennis added. I've been talking with other suppliers who used to work with Pinnacle, and there's a lot of interest in finding alternative ways to reach industrial clients. Tyler's approach has created problems for several companies in our supplier network. What kinds of problems? Payment term changes, automated ordering systems that don't work with our manufacturing processes, demands for pricing reductions that would eliminate our profit margins. Dennis listed. Several companies are looking for ways to maintain relationships with industrial clients without having to work through Pinnacle's new operational model. This information suggested that Tyler's changes had created systemic problems throughout Pinnacle's supplier network, not just isolated issues with individual vendors. If multiple suppliers were actively seeking alternatives to working with Pinnacle, the company's entire business model was at risk. Dennis, I'd be interested in learning more about the scope of these concerns, I said. Would you be willing to introduce me to some of the other suppliers who are experiencing similar issues? Absolutely. I think you'd find the conversations very enlightening. Wednesday brought the call I'd been expecting since the beginning of this crisis. Marcus's voice carried a tone of defeat that confirmed my suspicions about how rapidly Pinnacle's situation was deteriorating. Chloe, I need to update you on some developments, Marcus began. Rocky Mountain Industrial has formally terminated their contract with us. They've cited fundamental incompatibilities in operational approach and service delivery as the reason for cancellation. Patricia Hendricks had clearly decided that working directly with Precision Industrial Solutions was preferable to attempting to resolve service issues with Pinnacle. The language she'd used in the contract termination was professional but definitive, indicating that the decision was final rather than negotiable. They're also demanding immediate return of their project deposits and threatening legal action if we don't comply within 10 business days, Marcus continued. Their legal team is claiming that our service failures constitute breach of contract. This was a serious escalation that went beyond simple client dissatisfaction. If Rocky Mountain Industrial's legal team believed they had grounds for breach of contract claims, Pinnacle could face financial penalties that extended far beyond the loss of future revenue. Have you consulted with your legal counsel about the contract issues? I asked. Our attorneys are reviewing the situation, but they're concerned that Rocky Mountain might have legitimate claims, Marcus admitted. The service disruptions and communication failures over the past 2 weeks could be interpreted as material breaches of our service-level agreements. What about the other client relationships? 3 more companies have requested meetings to discuss the future of their partnerships with Pinnacle, Marcus said. That's typically corporate language for contract termination discussions. And the vendor situation? 6 suppliers have either terminated their contracts or announced that they won't be renewing when their current agreements expire, Marcus replied. Tyler's been trying to find replacement suppliers, but the pricing and terms we're being offered are significantly worse than what we had with our previous vendors. This development was entirely predictable. New suppliers who didn't have established relationships with Pinnacle would offer standard commercial terms rather than the preferential arrangements that had been negotiated through years of partnership. The cost increases and reduced service flexibility would make Pinnacle less competitive and further damage their ability to retain clients. Marcus, it sounds like Pinnacle is facing fundamental operational challenges that go beyond the specific vendor and client issues we've discussed, I said. What do you mean? I mean that the problems you're experiencing aren't just about relationships. They're about basic business viability, I explained. If you can't secure reliable suppliers at competitive prices, and you can't retain clients who are satisfied with your service quality, the company's financial sustainability is at risk. Marcus was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation that suggested he'd reached the same conclusion. Chloe, I think I need to consider whether Pinnacle can survive this situation. The revenue losses, combined with increased operational costs and potential legal liabilities, might be too much for the company to absorb. What are your options? I could try to find a buyer for the company, though the current operational problems would significantly reduce its value, Marcus said. Or I could work with our creditors and see if there's a way to restructure the business around whatever relationships and contracts we can salvage. And Tyler? Tyler has actually been helpful with the financial analysis and restructuring options, Marcus replied. His analytical skills are valuable for understanding the scope of our problems and evaluating potential solutions. I should have used him in that capacity from the beginning instead of putting him in charge of relationship management. This was the first time Marcus had acknowledged that Tyler's skills didn't match his assigned responsibilities. It was also recognition that the operational approach Marcus had endorsed wasn't appropriate for Pinnacle's industry and business model. Marcus, if you decide to pursue a restructuring option, you might want to consider focusing on areas where Pinnacle has sustainable competitive advantages, I suggested. What areas would those be? Internal operational efficiency, process analysis, cost management, areas where Tyler's skills would be valuable, and where you wouldn't be competing directly with companies that have stronger relationship management capabilities, I explained. So basically, becoming a different kind of company? Becoming a company that matches its operational approach to its actual capabilities and market position, I said, rather than trying to compete in areas where you don't have the expertise or relationships necessary for success. Marcus sighed heavily. It's ironic. I brought in Tyler to modernize Pinnacle and make it more competitive, but the changes we made actually reduced our competitiveness and damaged our market position. Tyler's approach might have been successful in a different industry or with a different business model, I said. The problem wasn't his capabilities. It was applying those capabilities in situations where they weren't appropriate. And now it might be too late to reverse the damage. It might be too late to return to Pinnacle's previous market position. I agreed. But it's not too late to build a sustainable business around the capabilities you actually have. As I hung up from the call with Marcus, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed from 2 weeks earlier. Pinnacle Manufacturing, which had been a successful and profitable company when I worked there, was now facing potential bankruptcy because of decisions made without understanding their industry dynamics or relationship requirements. Meanwhile, my own consulting practice was thriving beyond my initial expectations. The relationships and expertise that Marcus had undervalued were proving to be exactly what companies in the industrial sector needed and were willing to pay for. Thursday morning brought confirmation of what I'd suspected throughout the week. Angela Rodriguez called to inform me that 2 additional companies had approached Precision Industrial Solutions about direct manufacturing partnerships that would bypass traditional distributors entirely. The word is spreading quickly through the industry about the advantages of direct supplier relationships, Angela explained. Companies are realizing that they can get better service and more control over their manufacturing processes by working directly with suppliers instead of through intermediaries. Who are the companies that have expressed interest? Colorado Engineering Solutions and Front Range Industrial, Angela replied. Both are mid-sized companies with complex manufacturing requirements that would benefit from the kind of operational coordination you provide. These were exactly the kinds of clients that had made Pinnacle successful. Companies with sophisticated operational needs that required expertise and relationship management, rather than simple transactional efficiency. If these companies established direct supplier relationships, the traditional distributor model that Pinnacle represented would become increasingly obsolete. What kind of timeline are they considering? I asked. Colorado Engineering wants to start discussions next week, Angela said. They have a major project starting in the fall that would be perfect for testing a direct supplier relationship model. That afternoon, I had lunch with Robert Pinnacle, the original company founder who had sold the business to Marcus 3 years earlier. Robert had requested the meeting after hearing about Pinnacle's current difficulties through industry contacts. "Chloe, I have to tell you, what's happening at Pinnacle breaks my heart," Robert said as soon as we'd sat down. "That company was my father's legacy, and I spent 40 years building it into something I was proud of. To see it falling apart because of management decisions that ignored everything that made it successful, it's devastating. I understand how difficult this must be for you," I said. "Marcus called me yesterday asking for advice about potential restructuring options," Robert continued. "I told him the truth, that Pinnacle's value was always in its relationships and expertise, not in its operational efficiency or cost management. When you destroy the relationships, you destroy the business." "What did you tell him about restructuring?" "I told him that salvaging Pinnacle would require admitting that his modernization strategy was wrong and returning to the relationship-focused approach that made the company successful," Robert said. "But I also told him that might not be possible at this point, given how much damage has been done to the company's reputation." Robert paused to take a sip of his coffee, then looked at me directly. "Chloe, I want you to know that what happened to you was unconscionable. You were the best operational manager I ever worked with, and firing you was the stupidest decision Marcus could have made." "I appreciate that, Robert. I also want you to know that there are people in this industry who remember what you accomplished at Pinnacle and respect your expertise," Robert continued. "If you ever need references or recommendations for your consulting practice, I'd be honored to provide them." "That means a lot coming from you." "Actually, I have a more concrete proposition," Robert said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been talking with several other business owners about the changes happening in the industrial supply chain. There's growing interest in developing alternative distribution models that focus on relationship management and operational expertise rather than simple cost efficiency." "What kind of alternative models?" "Consulting-based partnerships that help companies develop direct relationships with specialized suppliers," Robert explained. "Instead of working through traditional distributors, companies would use consulting services to identify appropriate suppliers, negotiate partnerships, and coordinate complex projects." This was exactly the kind of business model that my consulting practice was naturally evolving toward. Rather than competing with traditional distributors like Pinnacle, I would help companies bypass distributors entirely by facilitating direct supplier relationships. "That sounds like it could be very successful," I said. "It could revolutionize how industrial procurement works," Robert agreed. "And you'd be perfectly positioned to lead that kind of transformation, given your expertise in industry relationships." "Are you suggesting some kind of formal business partnership?" "I'm suggesting that there might be opportunities for experienced industry professionals to collaborate on developing new business models that better serve industrial companies' operational needs," Robert said. "If you're interested in exploring those possibilities, I'd like to introduce you to some people who share that vision." As I drove home from lunch with Robert, I reflected on how dramatically my professional situation had changed in just 2 weeks. What had started as an unexpected job termination had evolved into opportunities to reshape how industrial procurement and operational management worked in my industry. The traditional distributor model that companies like Pinnacle represented was based on assumptions about efficiency and cost management that didn't account for the relationship dynamics and specialized expertise that made complex industrial projects successful. My consulting practice was demonstrating that companies were willing to pay for expertise and coordination services that helped them achieve better outcomes, even if those services cost more than traditional distributor markups. Friday brought the final confirmation of Pinnacle's collapse. Marcus called to inform me that the company would be filing for bankruptcy protection within the week. The legal costs from the Rocky Mountain industrial situation, combined with the revenue losses and increased operational expenses, have made the company financially unsustainable. Marcus explained, his voice carrying a note of defeat. "Our creditors aren't willing to extend additional credit, and we can't find buyers who are interested in acquiring a company with such significant operational problems." "What about the employees?" "We're trying to arrange severance packages for everyone, but the funding is limited," Marcus replied. "Tyler has actually been very helpful with the financial planning and employee transition coordination. He's much better suited for that kind of work than he was for vendor relationship management." "What are your plans after the bankruptcy?" "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. Whitfield Industries is disappointed with how the Pinnacle acquisition turned out, and I'm considering whether to stay with the parent company or look for other opportunities. And Tyler? Tyler has been offered a position with Whitfield Industries in their financial analysis department, Marcus said. It's work that matches his skills much better than what he was doing at Pinnacle. That sounds like a good outcome for him. Chloe, I want you to know that I recognize how badly I misjudged this situation, Marcus said, his tone becoming more personal. You tried to explain why the relationship-focused approach was important, and I dismissed your concerns because I thought efficiency and modernization were more important than personal connections. We all make decisions based on our understanding at the time, I replied. But my understanding was wrong, and my decisions destroyed a company that had been successful for decades, Marcus said. I should have listened to your expertise instead of assuming that business school theories would automatically translate to success in this industry. Marcus, different industries have different requirements and dynamics, I said. The approaches that work in some sectors don't necessarily work in others. That's not a personal failure. It's just a reality of business specialization. I suppose so, Marcus said. But it's still difficult to accept that my decisions led to this outcome. What matters now is learning from the experience and making better decisions in the future, I said. As I hung up from what would likely be my final conversation with Marcus Whitfield, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing vindication for the operational approach I'd advocated, but also genuine sadness about the destruction of a company that had been a significant part of my professional life for 20 years. The employees who would lose their jobs, the vendors who would lose a client, the clients who would need to find new suppliers, all of them would be affected by decisions that could have been avoided if relationship dynamics and industry expertise had been valued appropriately. But there was also excitement about the future. My consulting practice had grown from a desperate attempt to replace lost income into a thriving business that was helping to reshape how industrial companies approached procurement and operational management. The relationships and expertise that Marcus had dismissed as outdated were proving to be exactly what companies needed in an increasingly complex and specialized marketplace. That evening, I opened a bottle of champagne and toasted to new beginnings. 20 years of building something for someone else had ended, but the foundation of knowledge and relationships I'd developed was now serving as the basis for building something entirely my own. The phone calls from potential clients continued throughout the weekend, as word spread through the industry about both Pinnacle's bankruptcy and the success of the direct supplier relationship model I was facilitating. Companies that had never considered alternatives to traditional distributors were now exploring partnerships that would give them more control over their supply chains and access to specialized expertise when needed. By Sunday evening, I had consulting agreements with 4 companies, partnerships with 6 suppliers, and enough project work lined up to keep me busy for the next 6 months. More importantly, I had the satisfaction of knowing that my expertise was valued and that the work I was doing was helping companies achieve better operational outcomes. Marcus had fired me because he thought I was an obstacle to modernization and efficiency. What he'd actually done was force me to discover just how valuable my knowledge and relationships really were, while demonstrating to the entire industry that his approach to modernization was fundamentally flawed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning something elaborate. It's simply being so good at what you do that your absence becomes impossible to ignore. 6 months after Marcus Whitfield sent that termination email, I was sitting in the conference room of my new office suite, looking out at the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Reynolds Operations Consulting had grown from a desperate idea into a thriving business, with 12 employees, 37 active clients, and a waiting list that stretched 3 months into the future. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had fired me to modernize operations and reduce costs. Instead, he'd inadvertently launched me into a career that was more financially rewarding, professionally satisfying, and personally fulfilling than anything I'd experienced during my 20 years as an employee. The morning had started with a call from Janet Morrison at Summit Supply Solutions, who wanted to discuss expanding our partnership to include strategic planning services for their new business development initiatives. Janet's company had grown by 40% since establishing direct client relationships through my consulting practice, and they were ready to invest in additional operational expertise. Chloe, I have to tell you something, Janet said during our conversation. Working with your consulting team has transformed how we think about client relationships. Instead of just responding to orders and specifications, we're now collaborating with clients to develop better solutions and more efficient processes. This was exactly the kind of transformation I'd envisioned when I started the consulting practice. Rather than simply facilitating transactions between buyers and sellers, my team was helping companies develop genuine partnerships that created value for everyone involved. The partnership approach takes more time and requires more expertise, I replied, but the results justify the investment. Absolutely, Janet agreed. Our profit margins have improved significantly because we're providing higher value services instead of competing solely on price. And our client relationships are much stronger because we're seen as partners rather than just suppliers. After the call with Janet, I reviewed the quarterly financial reports that my business manager had prepared. Reynolds Operations Consulting had generated more revenue in 6 months than I'd earned in my final 3 years at Pinnacle. More importantly, the business was profitable from the beginning because our clients valued the expertise we provided and were willing to pay appropriate rates for specialized services. The success hadn't happened by accident. I'd built the consulting practice around principles that were exactly opposite to the approach Marcus had implemented at Pinnacle. Instead of prioritizing efficiency and cost reduction, we focused on relationship development and value creation. Instead of using standardized processes and automated systems, we provided personalized service tailored to each client's specific needs. Most importantly, we treated every vendor, supplier, and client relationship as a long-term partnership rather than a short-term transaction. This approach required more time and effort initially, but it created sustainable competitive advantages that couldn't be easily replicated by companies focused on operational efficiency. The phone rang again, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Quote, "Chloe, this is Tyler Brooks. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly." I was surprised to hear from Tyler, though not entirely shocked. Word traveled quickly through Denver's industrial community, and Tyler had probably heard about the success of my consulting practice through industry contacts. "Hello, Tyler. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, actually. I wanted to thank you for the advice you gave me during those difficult weeks at Pinnacle. You were right about my skills being better suited for analytical work rather than relationship management." Tyler's tone was humble and reflective, very different from the confident corporate demeanor he'd displayed during his time as Pinnacle's operations manager. "I'm glad things worked out for you," I said sincerely. "The position at Whitfield Industries has been perfect for me," Tyler continued. "I'm doing financial analysis and process optimization work that matches my background and interests. And I've learned a lot about the importance of understanding industry dynamics before trying to implement changes. That's valuable experience that will serve you well in your career." "Chloe, I also wanted to apologize for the way I handled things at Pinnacle," Tyler said, his voice becoming more serious. "I was so focused on implementing what I thought were best practices that I didn't take time to understand why the existing relationships worked. I should have listened to your expertise instead of assuming that my analytical approach would automatically be better." Tyler's apology was genuine and thoughtful, reflecting real understanding of what had gone wrong during his tenure at Pinnacle. It also demonstrated personal growth that suggested he'd learned from the experience, rather than simply blaming external factors for his difficulties. "Tyler, I appreciate you calling to say that," I replied. "The situation at Pinnacle was challenging for everyone involved, and I think we all learned important lessons from the experience. I definitely learned that different industries have different requirements, and that relationship management is a specialized skill that can't be replaced by analytical tools," Tyler said. "I also learned that asking questions and listening to experienced professionals is more important than implementing preconceived solutions. Those are insights that will make you more effective in any role you take on in the future." "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling," Tyler said. "I'm wondering if you might be willing to meet for coffee sometime to discuss the consulting industry. I'm interested in learning more about how operational consulting works and whether my analytical skills might be useful in that kind of environment." The request was unexpected but not unwelcome. Tyler had demonstrated genuine humility in learning from his mistakes, and his analytical capabilities could potentially be valuable in certain aspects of consulting work. "I'd be happy to meet with you, Tyler. Let me check my calendar and get back to you with some times that might work. Thank you, Chloe. I really appreciate your willingness to help me understand how to use my skills more effectively. After hanging up with Tyler, I reflected on how much both of our professional situations had changed. Tyler had found work that matched his capabilities and was apparently thriving in an environment where analytical skills were valued appropriately. Meanwhile, I discovered that the relationship management expertise that Marcus had dismissed was exactly what companies needed and were willing to pay premium rates to obtain. The afternoon brought a call that was both satisfying and bittersweet. Robert Pinnacle wanted to update me on developments related to the bankruptcy proceedings and discuss potential opportunities for collaboration. Chloe, I thought you'd want to know that the Pinnacle bankruptcy has been finalized, Robert said. The company's assets were sold to pay creditors, and the employees have all found other positions. It's officially the end of an era. How are you feeling about that outcome? I asked. Honestly, I'm relieved that it's over, Robert replied. Watching the company struggle for months, while Marcus tried to find buyers or restructuring options, was painful. At least now everyone can move forward with certainty about what happened. What about the employees? Were they able to find good positions? Most of them landed on their feet pretty quickly, Robert said. Your former team members in particular were in high demand because companies knew they'd been trained by you. Maria, the receptionist, is now working for Colorado Engineering Solutions. Several of the operational staff found positions with suppliers who knew their capabilities. This news was gratifying because it confirmed that the expertise and training I'd provided during my years at Pinnacle had real value that was recognized throughout the industry. The employees who'd worked with me were able to leverage that experience into new opportunities, even though the company itself hadn't survived. Robert, I'm glad to hear that people were able to transition successfully. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Robert continued. I've been talking with several other business owners about forming an industrial operations consortium. The idea would be to create a collaborative network of companies that share resources, expertise, and best practices for complex projects. That sounds like an interesting concept. How would it work? The consortium would include manufacturers, suppliers, and consulting firms that specialize in different aspects of industrial operations, Robert explained. Instead of competing with each other, member companies would collaborate on projects that require multiple types of expertise. And you think Reynolds Operations Consulting would be a good fit for this consortium? I think your consulting practice would be essential for this consortium, Robert said emphatically. The relationship management and operational coordination capabilities you provide are exactly what would make collaborative projects successful. The consortium concept was intriguing because it represented a formal structure for the kind of collaborative partnerships I'd been developing informally through my consulting practice. Instead of individual relationships between my clients and various suppliers, the consortium would create a network of companies that could work together on complex projects while sharing expertise and resources. Robert, I'd be very interested in learning more about this consortium idea. When are you planning to have discussions with potential members? I'm organizing a meeting for next month with about 15 companies that have expressed interest, Robert replied. Would you be available to attend as a potential founding member? Absolutely. Send me the details when you have them finalized. That evening, I had dinner with Angela Rodriguez to discuss the expansion of our partnership and her involvement in Robert's consortium concept. Angela's company, Precision Industrial Solutions, had become one of my most important strategic partners, and our collaboration had generated significant success for both businesses. Chloe, I have to tell you, working with your consulting team has exceeded every expectation I had when we first started discussing partnerships, Angela said as we reviewed our joint project results. The clients we're serving together are getting better outcomes, and both of our companies are more profitable than we would have been working independently. The partnership model creates value that neither of us could generate alone, I agreed. Your manufacturing expertise combined with our operational coordination capabilities produces results that are better than what traditional distributor relationships typically provide. That's exactly right, Angela said. And I think Robert's consortium idea could scale this partnership model to include many more companies and much larger projects. What's your perspective on the consortium concept? I think it could revolutionize how industrial projects are managed, Angela replied. Instead of having one company trying to coordinate multiple suppliers and subcontractors, the consortium would allow specialized companies to collaborate directly while sharing the coordination responsibilities. And you'd be interested in participating as a founding member? Definitely. Precision has the manufacturing capabilities to handle complex projects, but we don't have the business development resources to identify opportunities or the operational expertise to coordinate multi-company initiatives. The consortium would give us access to both of those capabilities. Angela's enthusiasm for the consortium concept reinforced my sense that Robert was onto something significant. The traditional model of having one company manage all aspects of complex industrial projects was becoming increasingly inefficient as projects became more specialized and technical requirements became more demanding. The consortium approach would allow companies to focus on their core competencies while collaborating with other specialists to deliver comprehensive solutions. My consulting practice would provide the operational coordination and relationship management expertise that made such collaborations successful. Angela, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, I said. I've been thinking about expanding Reynolds Operations Consulting to include specialized divisions that focus on different aspects of industrial operations. What kinds of divisions? Project management, vendor relations, supply chain optimization, and business development, I listed. Each division would have experts who understand specific aspects of industrial operations, but they'd all work together to provide comprehensive consulting services. That sounds like it would position your consulting practice to handle much larger and more complex engagements. Exactly. Instead of being limited to projects that I can personally manage, we could take on initiatives that require multiple specialists working in coordination. Angela nodded thoughtfully. And if Reynolds Operations Consulting had that kind of capacity, you could serve as the coordinating entity for consortium projects. Companies like Precision could focus on manufacturing while your team handled the overall project management and vendor coordination. That's exactly what I was thinking. The conversation with Angela crystallized ideas that had been developing in my mind for months. The success of my consulting practice had demonstrated that companies valued operational expertise and relationship management capabilities. The consortium concept provided a framework for scaling those capabilities to handle much larger and more complex projects. More importantly, both developments represented validation of the operational philosophy that Marcus had rejected when he fired me. Relationship-focused, expertise-driven approaches to industrial operations were proving to be more successful than efficiency-focused, cost-reduction strategies. The following week brought a call that provided the perfect capstone to the transformation of my professional situation. Patricia Hendricks from Rocky Mountain Industrial wanted to discuss a major expansion of our consulting relationship. Chloe, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting. Patricia began. Rocky Mountain's Board of Directors has approved a strategic initiative to establish direct supplier relationships for all of our major procurement needs. They want to eliminate traditional distributors entirely and work directly with manufacturers through consulting partnerships. That's a significant change in procurement strategy. What prompted the decision? The success of our partnership with Precision Industrial Solutions convinced the board that direct supplier relationships provide better service, more control, and lower costs than working through distributors, Patricia explained. They want to apply that model to all of our supplier relationships. And they want Reynolds Operations Consulting to coordinate this transition? They want your consulting practice to manage the entire process, Patricia said. Identifying appropriate suppliers, negotiating partnership agreements, establishing operational protocols, and providing ongoing coordination for complex projects. The scope of what Patricia was describing represented a complete transformation of how Rocky Mountain Industrial approached procurement and supplier management. Instead of working through companies like Pinnacle, they would establish direct relationships with specialized manufacturers while using my consulting services to coordinate complex projects and manage vendor relationships. Patricia, that sounds like exactly the kind of comprehensive consulting engagement that Reynolds Operations Consulting is designed to handle. The board is prepared to authorize a 3-year consulting contract with automatic renewal options, Patricia continued. They see this as a strategic partnership that will give Rocky Mountain significant competitive advantages in project management and cost control. What's the timeline for implementing this transition? We'd want to start immediately with a pilot program involving 3 major suppliers, then expand to include all procurement relationships over the following 18 months, Patricia said. The board is committed to making this work because they believe direct supplier relationships represent the future of industrial procurement. After the call with Patricia, I sat in my office considering how dramatically the industrial procurement landscape was changing. Companies that had traditionally relied on distributors like Pinnacle were discovering that direct supplier relationships, coordinated through specialized consulting services, provided better outcomes for complex projects. This transformation wasn't just benefiting my consulting practice. It was creating new opportunities for manufacturers, suppliers, and other service providers who were willing to adapt their business models to focus on partnership and collaboration rather than simple transactional efficiency. The phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in months, but I recognized it immediately. Chloe, this is Marcus Whitfield. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I was surprised to hear from Marcus, though I'd occasionally wondered what had happened to him after Pinnacle's bankruptcy. His voice sounded different, less confident and corporate, more humble and reflective. Hello, Marcus. How are you doing? I'm doing well, actually. I wanted to thank you for your professionalism during those difficult final weeks at Pinnacle. You had every right to be angry about how you were treated, but you maintained your integrity throughout the entire situation. Marcus's tone was genuinely appreciative and carried none of the defensive or manipulative qualities I'd heard during our last conversations, when he was desperately trying to save Pinnacle. I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I also wanted you to know that I've learned a tremendous amount from the Pinnacle experience, Marcus continued. I've spent the past several months reflecting on what went wrong and why my approach was so fundamentally flawed. And what conclusions have you reached? I realized that I was trying to apply generic business principles to an industry that requires specialized expertise and relationship management skills. Marcus said, I treated vendor and client relationships as simple transactional arrangements, when they were actually complex partnerships that required trust and mutual respect. Marcus's analysis was accurate and demonstrated genuine understanding of why his modernization strategy had failed so spectacularly. It also suggested that he'd engaged in honest self-reflection, rather than simply blaming external factors for Pinnacle's collapse. Those are important insights that will make you more effective in future leadership roles, I said. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling, Marcus said. I've accepted a position as a strategic planning consultant with a firm that specializes in helping companies navigate organizational transitions. The Pinnacle experience, as painful as it was, taught me valuable lessons about the importance of understanding industry dynamics and respecting existing expertise. That sounds like work that would utilize your analytical capabilities while avoiding the relationship management challenges that created problems at Pinnacle. Exactly. And I wanted to ask if you might be willing to serve as a reference for my consulting work. Several potential clients have asked about my experience with operational transformations, and I think your perspective on what happened at Pinnacle could be valuable for helping them understand the importance of taking relationship dynamics into account. The request was unexpected, but not unreasonable. Marcus had clearly learned from his mistakes and was now working in a role that better matched his capabilities. Providing a reference that honestly described both his analytical strengths and the lessons he'd learned from the Pinnacle experience could be helpful for potential clients. Marcus, I'd be willing to serve as a reference, as long as I can provide an honest assessment of both your capabilities and the lessons learned from the Pinnacle situation. That's exactly what I'd want, Marcus replied. I think potential clients need to understand that organizational transformation requires careful attention to industry dynamics and existing relationships, not just analytical optimization. I agree completely. Chloe, there's one more thing I wanted to say, Marcus added, his voice becoming more personal. I owe you an apology for how I handled your termination. Sending that email was impersonal and disrespectful, especially given your 20 years of service and everything you'd accomplished at Pinnacle. I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I also want you to know that I recognize now how valuable your expertise was and how foolish I was to dismiss your concerns about the operational changes we were implementing. You were trying to protect relationships and capabilities that were essential to Pinnacle's success, and I should have listened to your advice. Marcus's apology was genuine and demonstrated real understanding of how his decisions had affected both me personally and Pinnacle's business outcomes. It also represented acknowledgement that the operational approach I'd advocated was actually more appropriate for the industry than the efficiency-focused strategy he'd implemented. "We all make decisions based on our understanding at the time," I replied. "The important thing is learning from those experiences and making better decisions going forward." "That's very generous of you to say," Marcus said. "I hope someday I'll have the opportunity to demonstrate that I've learned from those mistakes." After the call with Marcus, I reflected on how much had changed for everyone involved in the Pinnacle situation. Marcus had found work that better matched his capabilities and was apparently applying lessons learned from his mistakes. Tyler had discovered that his analytical skills were valuable in appropriate contexts. The Pinnacle employees had found new positions where their expertise was appreciated. And I had built a consulting practice that was more successful and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced as an employee. The transformation hadn't been planned or deliberately orchestrated. It had emerged naturally from the consequences of decisions that undervalued relationship management and operational expertise. Marcus's attempt to modernize Pinnacle by dismissing my approach had inadvertently proven that my approach was exactly what companies in the industrial sector needed and valued. The following month, Robert's consortium meeting exceeded all expectations. 15 companies attended, representing manufacturers, suppliers, consulting firms, and engineering services. The enthusiasm for collaborative partnership models was unanimous, and by the end of the meeting, we had established the Colorado Industrial Operations Consortium, with Reynolds Operations Consulting as the coordinating entity. The consortium structure formalized the partnership approaches I'd been developing informally through individual client relationships. Member companies would collaborate on complex projects while sharing expertise, resources, and risks. My consulting practice would provide operational coordination, relationship management, and project oversight services that ensured successful collaboration. Within 6 weeks of the consortium launch, we had secured contracts for 3 major projects that required collaboration between multiple member companies. The total value of these projects exceeded anything I'd worked on during my time at Pinnacle, and the profit margins were significantly higher because we were providing specialized expertise rather than competing on commodity pricing. A year after Marcus sent that termination email, I was featured on the cover of Industrial Operations Quarterly magazine as Consultant of the Year. The article described how Reynolds Operations Consulting had revolutionized industrial procurement through relationship-focused partnership models that prioritize value creation over cost optimization. The irony was perfect. Marcus had fired me because he thought my relationship-focused approach was outdated and inefficient. The industry had recognized that approach as innovative and transformative. But the real satisfaction didn't come from external recognition or financial success. It came from the knowledge that I was doing work that created genuine value for clients, partners, and the broader industrial community. Companies were achieving better project outcomes, suppliers were building sustainable partnerships, and employees throughout the industry were working in environments that valued expertise and collaboration. The termination email that had seemed so devastating a year earlier had actually been the catalyst for discovering possibilities I'd never imagined while working as an employee. Marcus had intended to eliminate what he saw as an obstacle to modernization. Instead, he'd forced me to demonstrate that my expertise was valuable enough to build an entire business around. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the worst situations. Sometimes being undervalued by one organization leads to discovering your true worth in the marketplace. And sometimes the people who dismiss your contributions end up providing the motivation you need to achieve success beyond anything you'd previously considered possible. The phone buzzed with a text message from Angela Rodriguez. Consortium project update. Rocky Mountain expansion completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Client wants to discuss additional partnerships. Great work coordinating everything. I smiled and looked out at the Denver skyline, thinking about how much my professional life had changed since that Tuesday morning when Marcus's email arrived. The company that had dismissed my value was gone. The relationships and expertise that had been undervalued were now the foundation of a thriving business. And the industry that had once seemed limited by traditional distributor models was embracing partnership approaches that created better outcomes for everyone involved. Marcus Whitfield had fired me to modernize operations and improve efficiency. He'd achieved exactly the opposite of what he intended. while inadvertently launching me into the most successful phase of my career. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.